Now, Richard, you've flown all the way out here from the US of A. I've got you in a bit of a jet lag position, but you know, you're a busy person and much in demand, so I appreciate you spending some time.
Happy to.
Just so that we're, you know, start out in some sort of foundation, what is your area? What have you flown out here to talk to us New Zealanders about?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm a writer, kind of an environmental philosopher. I teach the subject of human ecology at New College of California in Santa Rosa. But what I'm here to talk about is something that I've spent the past 10 years researching, which is global oil depletion. Of course, we all know that the world runs on cheap oil and has for decades. We've built a world that runs its planes, trains, and automobiles on gasoline and diesel fuel refined from oil. We have an agricultural system that uses enormous amounts of oil. And yet, of course, oil is a non-renewable resource. And so, in effect, we started running out when we pumped the very first barrel out of the ground. But it's going to really start catching up with us, not when we finish off the last barrel, but much sooner than that, when we get to the point at which we can no longer grow the supply on a daily or yearly basis. We've built this industrial growth economy on the basis of always having more energy to do more things with, to travel further, to build more stuff and manufacture things and distribute them and so on. But all of that requires energy, and most of it's fossil fuel energy. When we get to the point where the amount of availability of energy starts to decline, that's when we start to see the problems. And that point, as far as I can tell with regard to oil, is very, very close, if in fact we're not already there.
Now, don't take this personally, but you've come out from the US, you're using words us, we, our. Now that's really what we could call the modern industrial economy. Sure. And in the case of New Zealanders, it does apply. You know, we're firmly into that economy.
Absolutely.
However, there are vast stretches of the world, and the majority of the population, who are either well out or just getting in. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm thinking of India and China as two classic examples, but then Eastern Europe is a similar situation there. And I don't think they identify with the problems that are facing us so clearly that we can't sort of use the royal we and include everybody at all. There are huge parts of the world who, no matter how crystal clear the problems that the North America, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, England are having, they would firmly disidentify with that and say, well, that's your problem. Mm-hmm. But we are now heading into an industrial system that you've had for quite some time, benefited from, and we're going there. And, you know, we'll somehow get around these problems, but we're not going to pull the stops out now to help you, because they're not us. Now,
I'm not suggesting.
Do you agree there?
I'm not suggesting that they can or should do anything to help the industrialized countries with their problem. But this is a problem that's going to affect every country, and already is. It's actually affecting the poorest countries first, because there are many poor countries that import oil that now can't afford to do so because oil is at $80 US per barrel right now. Countries like Zimbabwe and Zambia in southern sub-Saharan Africa, basically their oil imports have evaporated because they can't afford to buy the stuff. China is now the world's second foremost oil importing nation. So, of course, China has a lot of revenues that it gets from exporting goods and so on. So it can actually afford to bid up the price of oil. And the Chinese have been very clever about securing long-term contracts with Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and other countries. But nevertheless, as time goes on, those oil exporting countries are using more and more of their own oil domestically. So the amount that's available for export declines even faster than the total global supply. Every country is going to be impacted by this. It's not just the already industrialized countries, but certainly the countries like New Zealand and the US and Canada that have very high per capita oil consumption because of their suburban development and reliance on automobiles and trucks. Those countries are going to be dramatically impacted. There's no question about that.
And a unified response is always better than a disunified response. My point now is that it's very, very difficult to get a unified response even within the existing industrialized countries.
Right.
And the first question is, I think anyone who isn't blind can see that oil is going to keep going up in price, and the amount of it's going to become less and less more available, and therefore
you'd be surprised. A couple of years ago, most economists would have said that's nonsense.
Yes.
The economists 2 years ago were anticipating $40 a barrel oil right now, and obviously they were wrong. But this is still news to many people in government and in chairs and economics in universities around the world.
Yes.
They still are running on the assumption that global oil production won't peak for another 20 or 30 or 40 years, and that really maybe we should be reducing the amount we use in order to deal with climate change, but the supply problems just aren't here yet.
Well, I'll tell you what, we'll dispense with them.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, we'll, economists aren't well known for their ability to predict the future. Scientists have tremendous problems, but economists, I wouldn't even go there. No, we'll assume that the peak oil thing, I'm happy to assume that if it isn't now, it's next year or very soon, and that it is going to have a dramatic effect. I totally agree with you there. I think a lot of people would agree with that. If we go from that assumption rather than have that debate, which will just take up time, if we go from that assumption and assume that someone watching agrees with that, what is the response that we can make? Because we're in what could be called an oil economy.
Right.
It is an economy, as you described right at the beginning, it's literally floating on oil. And so we have that problem to deal with, that the oil is sinking, and so the pool of oil that we're floating on is drawing in. And that's always a problem if you're a fish in a pool that's drawing in, and that's what we are. And then there's the problem of those nations that are just coming into the industrial oil economy. A middle class is burgeoning there. It's producing a few extremely rich, young, entrepreneurial, gung-ho types who, because they're billionaires, think that they know absolutely everything. These people, these are in the Russias, the Indias, the Chinas. These people are coming out having tremendous influence, growing influence in the world. How is the West going to respond? And then how is the non-West going to be brought in? Do you have any ideas about that? Assuming we are facing this crisis, what can we do? Well,
the trajectory we're on right now is for the oil-producing nations to consume more and more of what they're producing, such as Russia. Russia's domestic consumption of oil is rising dramatically. So even though Russia's production of oil is still increasing a bit, the rate of increase has started to level off, but Russia's domestic consumption is rising so fast that Russian net oil exports have already started to decline.
That's interesting.
And that's significant because Russia is the main engine of oil production growth outside of OPEC. So that means that basically from here on out, unless OPEC can grow global supply, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay, so the trajectory we're on now is for the countries that are producing oil to use more of their own oil domestically, and for the countries that can afford to import oil to soak up what remains of the global export supply. That means the US, China, Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and not many more. You know, most other countries are basically going to be left out of the global petroleum fiesta because they can't afford the ticket at the door. Then the next phase after that is for more geopolitical competition between those wealthier countries that can still afford to import oil, and that, of course, includes US and China right at the top of the list. At the end of the day, we're looking at a scenario of what I call last one standing. And it's a very grim kind of scenario because it means countries really trying to protect their ability to continue with their modern economies, modern economic growth at all cost, including essentially global war.
Yeah.
The alternative to that has to be some kind of cooperative global system for reducing oil dependence. Now, I've actually written a book on this subject called the Oil Depletion Protocol. It's not my idea. The idea for the Oil Depletion Protocol has been around for about 15 years. Several petroleum geologists have put it forward, notably Colin Campbell, the British petroleum geologist. And essentially, all it says is countries that use oil would agree to use less, and the rate of reduction would be tied to the global depletion rate, which is about 2.5%. So every year we use about 2.5% of the remaining global oil supply. Wow. So if we could reduce our consumption by about 2.5% per year, what that would do would be to reduce the pressure on supplies, reduce the competition for remaining supplies, and also enable us to plan ahead so we would know how much we would have next year and the year after that, so we can begin to transition our economies away from oil dependence. That's the best case scenario. It's the smart thing to do.
Something that came to me there was you've pointed out how competition is most likely to happen, which would lead to, in the worst case scenario, the last man standing, but at least a lot more conflict than there's already here. Right. And after all, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, it's all about oil. It's already started. It's not new.
We've been having oil wars for a century.
Yeah. These wars are going on, and they stand to get worse as the oil goes down. So it'll be more of the same, only worse. Now, you are saying the obvious, and the thing I was trying to point out at the beginning, that really we need to cooperate. This is a problem that affects us all. Equals, simple formula, equals, affects us all, therefore let's all work together to deal with the problem.
Absolutely.
But we live in an age where the industrial capitalism has triumphed, and at the core of capitalism is the Malthusian principle of competition leading to survival of the fittest, leading to evolution. Therefore, competition is a law of nature according to our system. Mm-hmm. And if you go in any large company, or they talk about cooperation and teams and all that, but if you go to the boardroom, it's either buy them out or kill them.
Right. Yeah,
there's absolutely no concept of cooperation whatsoever in the business acumen or in the business schools or anything at all. So realistically, what are the chances of cooperation breaking out in the global economy?
Well, we're already seeing the push to cooperate on some kind of global climate agreement.
Yeah.
We've had other agreements, such as the Montreal Protocol governing CFC emissions and so on. So the principle is there. Now we just need to implement it on a global scale with regard to all fossil fuels. It's going to be an enormous challenge, there's no question about it, because fossil fuels have been the basis of wealth creation, industrial growth for the past 200 years. But that party is coming to an end. There's no getting around it. It's not just a matter of reducing our fossil fuel consumption for the sake of future generations or the polar bears. The fact is that oil depletion is hitting home now. Natural gas peak will not be far behind. And by the latest estimates, there's much less coal than most of us have been led to think. In fact, global coal production could peak in something like 15 to 20 years. That being the case, really, we're going to be using less in the future one way or another. So we'll be much better off if we plan for it and if we organize the process cooperatively. In principle, it's a very easy sell. I know that it's in practice, it's going to be an uphill battle. There's no question. But that's why people like me are going around the world talking about this stuff right now to raise awareness. That's why Al Gore is making his films about climate and so on. We have to get the general population aware of these issues so that they can put pressure on world leaders to do what may be very difficult for them to do otherwise.
You know, I think that's the most realistic statement I've heard in a long time. Because what you're saying without, I can sort of be more dramatic and use hyperbole and all that, but what we've got is a system where, you know, the oil, after all, wasn't run by governments in the whole. It's large oil companies have run it since the beginning of time.
And the large oil companies, in many cases, have run the governments.
Thank you for saying that and saving me the time.
Yeah.
Now, and that's still the case.
Yes.
Today. Bush is the oil president, and soon after being elected, he's in Iraq. No coincidence. Now.
No, that was all about weapons of mass destruction. I'm sorry.
Oh, sure.
Yes.
Yeah. Ho ho. But now, what you're sort of recognizing in your quiet American non-class struggle way is that for the sort of change to take place, which is a change towards cooperation. Now, so far, the pressure, when people think the air is threatened and that the rain is threatened and, you know, that they breathe, the air that they breathe, the rain that they need to grow food, and the wind that could blow their house over, their house, not someone else's, their house, at any time, they do manage to find it affects absolutely everybody, and the pressure goes on so quickly, as it did with the CFCs, but even more especially with climate change. I mean, I was doing programs about climate change about 4 years ago, and it was this side issue, and we had visiting speakers about climate from England, and, you know, it was sort of like novel. Now, suddenly, you know, Al Gore, America's got in behind it, and in that sense, and he's managed to show people, to even people in the US, I assume, I don't know,
well,
that this is a real threat.
Right, it hasn't really impacted government policy yet.
No.
I think at some point in the next 2 or 3 years there will be some legislation in the U.S., but it's probably going to be fairly weak, at least to start with, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But the awareness has been raised.
Well, it has, and it's even got to Bush. But my final point. Yeah. So that happened around air, but air wasn't owned and sold by large corporations as much as they'd like to. They haven't managed that one yet. However, oil is. Oil is owned and sold by large corporations who act together in a very distinct way. Only the world's split down the middle, sort of between the OPECs and the non-OPECs, and that caused a big crisis. But the chance, whenever some public pressure comes on and people respond to these and other talks, and someone does a program about peak oil that has a similar effect to the one that Al Gore did, at that time the pressure will come on. But this time, unlike air, there are large corporations with enormous wealth and vested interests in keeping the competition going. After all, this last man standing, the oil companies will be making super profits even until the last man falls.
Yeah. Well,
and they are going to resist us hugely. So therefore the sort of movement you need to move them, can we be hopeful?
Well, I don't think the situation in that regard is quite as dire as you're saying, because the oil companies are going to be making money however this shakes out.
Exactly.
I mean,
I see.
even if we do it cooperatively, they'll still make money down to the last drop.
Yeah.
But if we have global war over oil, the oil companies, in fact, are not going to like that very much. It's not going to be very in their interest.
Good for business.
I mean, who wants to do business in Iraq right now?
Yes.
I mean, what oil company is going to send its precious engineering staff into Mosul or some other Iraqi city to work and possibly get kidnapped and so on? I think, in fact, the oil industry would prefer to see a cooperative solution to this if it can be organized also at the governmental level. Now, we have to remember that only about 10% of global oil reserves are in the hands of the oil industry. The other 90% are in the hands of the nationalized oil companies of OPEC and Mexico, on and on. Most of the major oil-producing nations, Venezuela is a member of OPEC. Most of the major oil-producing nations have nationalized oil industries, and so they have to be brought into this cooperative agreement as well. They have often very different interests from one another. Look at Russia's interests vis-a-vis those of Europe, for example. Russia is a fossil fuel powerhouse and wants to use its fossil fuels as a way of regaining some of the geopolitical influence that it lost at the end of the Cold War. Well, somehow that has to be, Russia's place at the table has to be respected, but at the same time, it can't be allowed to use its fossil fuels for a kind of global blackmail, because that's very destabilizing. But the only way to avoid that is to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. As long as we're all desperately needing this stuff, whoever has it is ultimately going to be calling the tune, and also will ultimately be fighting over the last drops. No matter how you slice it, it always comes out the same way. We've got to reduce our reliance.
That's a very interesting point. If we assume that we're, as George Bush said, addicted to oil and can't break the addiction, can't go cold turkey.
I mean, it's nice of him to point out that we're addicted to oil, but okay, so how do you deal with an addiction? Well, the only effective way to deal with an addiction is stop using the addictive substance. Yeah. You can't, if you were addicted, say, to heroin, well, you could sort of transfer your addiction to methadone or something like that, but that wouldn't really solve the problem until you actually started using less, and that's what we have to do with fossil fuels.
So there's a two-pronged approach then. There's on the one hand, we have to immediately start reducing our fossil fuels, which I'd like to talk about how we could do that.
Sure.
And that has a fantastically, if you do it right, good effect on the whole climate change as well.
Absolutely.
So there's complete synergy there,
Yep.
which is an extremely powerful argument. The other one is that nevertheless, there are countries that probably aren't going to reduce their production, sale and use of this fossil fuel. The West might bite the bullet, but the others might not.
There are very few producers who aren't going to be in a situation, if they're not already, very soon, of not being able to continue producing as much as they are now. Most oil-producing countries are already in decline. And something like an oil depletion protocol, which would mandate reduction in production as well as consumption, would in fact enable countries like Saudi Arabia to preserve their patrimony for the next generation. If they try to produce it as fast as they can, as soon as they can, that means they sell it for the lowest price because the price is only going to be going up, and they have nothing left on which to build an economy once it's gone. So it's in the interest of the oil producers to produce less, just as it's in the interest of the oil consumers to consume less, if we can do this cooperatively and get our minds fixed on the problem.
Well, I still believe you're basically saying a two-pronged approach, because that cooperation, as I said, may break out in certain enlightened middle-class parts of the world who are very perceptive about their long-term interests. But in other burgeoning, newly arising middle classes, not to mention those who have no hope of even reaching a decent food supply and who've been cut out of the oil economy, there is going to be tremendous tension. And then you've got the large companies, and the whole thing, as you pointed out, no matter how you dice it, there's going to be problems. And it's going to have tremendous commercial implications, and competition rules commerce. Therefore, we really also need a mass consciousness from underneath,
right,
which is going to provide the final step where, whether you like it or not, large company as you are, we have, got so much support for our move that we're actually going to take away the free market in this product, and whether you like it or not. And that the same thing might even happen in China and India if we're lucky, but certainly in the West there has to be that. So it's a political movement as well as an education. Well, the two always go together anyway, aren't they?
Yeah.
You're not relying on one or the other. To sort of...
Well, the political movement can't really happen until the education is there, until people are aware of the nature of the problem, until people are aware of the fact of oil depletion. I mean, in the U.S., it's always politicized. If you're a Democrat, oil price goes up, well, it's the fault of the oil companies. If you're a Republican, the oil price goes up, well, it's the fault of the people in the Middle East. And the fact of the matter is, oil price is going up for only one reason. Demand is up and supply isn't. And until we really deeply understand that we've gotten ourselves addicted to a substance that is going away, that's not going to be here for us, and it's no one's fault, it's everyone's fault. We've all been complicit in this. Until we really get that, the kinds of solutions we're likely to come up with are ones that are demonizing one group or one nation or whatever, and that's not going to solve the problem.
Well, you could say it's demonizing America, but like I said, the hardest sell you're going to have isn't in this country. It's going to be back in your home country.
It's in the U.S. It's also in China. I'd say if we can get those two countries on board, then it's clear sailing after that.
So, I mean, you're not saying that if we could reform the consuls and the Emperor of Rome in the 4th century AD, we could save the empire, are you? I mean, honestly, what are the chances of reforming America that radically that when you say we, you really mean the US people? What are the chances really of reforming that system sufficiently to rein in those large companies sufficiently to actually bring about the sort of cooperation within the country and between it and China and other countries sufficiently to actually deal with this problem? I mean, I've got to admit, that would be the most pessimistic scenario I've got. I feel that America has to suffer direct defeats and reverses economically and politically always follows the economics anyway, but especially economically, before it will wake up. That's what I feel.
Well, certainly the best case scenario would be if we can get a proactive response, if folks can understand the problem and act before the crisis hits.
Case,
yes. I think that's extremely unlikely.
I do too.
I think the most likely scenario is that oil prices will soar. The U.S. economy is balanced on a knife edge anyway because of the debt crisis and the mortgage crisis and all of those things. And I think the rising oil prices will be one of the factors that will send it over the edge. And it may take several years of real economic turmoil in that country before some basic policies are changed. That's what happened during the Great Depression in the 1930s. And
Yeah.
I just hope that as the U.S. slides into times of real hardship, it has leadership that is able to do what FDR did during the 1930s, and look at this as an opportunity to reform the system, to bring a cooperative approach, to redistribute wealth. Because the other strategy would be a fascistic one.
World War III. That's the. I mean,
Well,
after all,
it would be fascism and World War. Yes.
Yes.
And that's entirely possible. I would hate to see that outcome.
Well, that goes without saying. So we're really down to tin tacks now, aren't we? We've got an empire, and that's what it was promulgating itself as in the late 1990s. The neoliberal was the new American empire. We've got an empire now that has suffered a big defeat around its core element of control, the oil supply of the world, and it's now starting to suffer economically. It's by any measure, it's not in a stable economic situation.
No.
So it could go down now. It will, of course, being an empire, take a hell of a lot down with it. Us and England
Yeah, we really
included,
have a global empire at this point. I mean, if the U.S. economy tanks, that impacts China as well, because China, much of China's trade is with the U.S.
Well, now there is see, this is the complication, isn't it? That it's no good talking about the Great Depression, because at that time conditions were quite different. The countries really were more or less insular to a large extent. Germany wanted to be an empire and failed. The US sort of became an economic one, but nevertheless, because this is the paradox of life, that the more it expanded out and seemed to control, the other side of that coin is that all of those tentacles that go out control it. And this is what the Roman Empire found, maybe as a shock, I don't know, that it did control vast tracts, but in the end, they controlled it, because they had to either keep them going or they would collapse, and they would then invade or have a massive effect on back in Rome itself.
Right.
So either you're controlling or being controlled. Now, the minute you start losing your control, then they start hitting back. Now, China is now involved, as you pointed out. So it's a very difficult scenario. China might pump up the US economy, funnily enough. Everyone's predicting China-US clash. It could be the other way around, but China might be just as Saudi Arabia would.
No, China certainly doesn't want to see the US dollar collapse.
No.
It has enormous investments denominated in US dollars. It doesn't want to see a dollar collapse. So, yes, China is going to do everything it can. And the irony is that China's and the US's interests are diametrically opposed in many ways. I mean, they both need to import enormous amounts of oil. China's main supplier of oil is Iran, and the U.S. is trying to undermine the Iranian regime in every possible way, is even threatening to bomb Iran, which of course China does not want to see happen. And yet the two countries, China and the U.S., are so interlinked economically that I think any kind of open conflict is extremely unlikely, and in fact, I think China would go to great lengths to prop up the U.S. economy.
So it's in China's interest to maintain the Walmartization of America,
right.
To maintain the dollar, and to maintain the stability of the economy in order that it will continue to garner interests from its investments
and
there.
Also, China has domestic political problems. If China's economy fails to continue growing at a very high rate, then those domestic political problems start to bubble to the surface. It's been papering over a lot of domestic dissent with high rates of economic growth, with the promise that this wealth will ultimately be spread around and rising tide lifts all boats, sort of thing.
Yes.
But if that economic growth stalls because the U.S. economy tanks, or because the price of oil rises too high it could mean enormous problems in China as well. So it's the entire global political system is very complex, very finely balanced, and it seems to be shifting and changing in very disquieting ways.
Am I taking a dead-end street here when I say that the triumph of capitalism has led to a global interlinking of the market?
Oh, of course, yes.
And therefore, for 1,000 years, no less than that, maybe 800 years, the nation state was the primary economic and political unit in the world. England was England when it started its first, sort of global economy after Rome.
Well, the modern nation state really starts with fossil fuels. I mean,
yes.
The states certainly existed before the industrial era, but with the modern fossil fuel era and navies running on oil and international trade and global trade and so on, we really get the modern economic system that we call capitalism. It hardly existed in any recognizable form before the fossil fuel era. I suspect that capitalism can't survive the end of the fossil fuel era because it depends on continual economic growth, and without cheap energy, I don't think continual economic growth is possible. What we need is a kind of steady state economy. The Earth can provide resources only at a certain rate, at the rate at which they can be naturally replenished. To run economies on non-renewable resources at ever-expanding rates of extraction is insanity. I mean, it's absurd, and yet we've accepted that as the basis for our national economies for the last 200 years. Well, finally, the absurdity of it is catching up with us, and it's going to undo, I think, a lot of economic certainties, so-called, that we've come to accept as being perfectly natural, but in fact, can't continue.
So the nation state, you're right. Every culture accepts that its system is natural, deemed as natural,
sure.
eternal,
Yeah.
and universal. But it will come as a rude shock that the nation state is not natural and eternal. In fact, it's probably already over in many ways. And that will cause tremendous political upheaval until some other way of dealing with the global system. But not only that, as you just pointed out, it's capitalism itself that is on the line, isn't it? It's not just this or that country. How is this or that country going to deal with it? Will they go economy crash? Or dear me, how sad, but I just hope I'm not living there at the time. Or will they go to war, or will we somehow, will our country come out? No, it's not that. It's now, will the system change? That is capitalism, rampant sort of capitalism. Mm-hmm. Will it change to something that we can all live with? Mm-hmm. Is that really the question?
Well, of course, yeah. And it has to be some kind of steady state economy that exists within nature's limits. And I don't think anybody knows exactly what that'll be, but it certainly isn't what we think of as capitalism now, because the way capitalism operates now, it operates entirely on the basis of continual growth. Yes. That can't continue.
Absolutely. Now, do you not have any hints, or you've obviously thought about this?
Well, there's a whole school of what's called ecological economics, and textbooks have been written about it, and so on. It might require altogether new thinking about currency, for example, because our currencies, most of our national currencies now, are loaned into existence, debt-based currencies that require continual growth in monetary supply in order to stave off currency collapse. We can't have that. We have to have some kind of different currency that's not based on debt and interest. Exactly what that will look like. There are lots of ideas that have been floated out there. You could have an energy-based currency, for example, or local currencies. Many places are already experimenting with those.
The real market of the future that people should be looking to and beginning to participate in is the market of ideas around a sustainable economy.
Well, sustainability is the future. You know, whatever is not sustainable is almost by definition
Yes.
going to collapse or fade away. So we have to look, well, what is sustainable? And there are certain very basic principles that define what sustainability is. One of them is that you can only use renewable resources at the rate at which they can be naturally replenished. It's simple, it's obvious, and yet we haven't been abiding by that with very few exceptions. You know, we harvest fish from the ocean at far greater than the replacement rate, cut down forests faster than they can regrow, and so on. Well, obviously that has to change. Another very simple principle, obvious, you can't base an economy on non-renewable resources and extracting them at ever-increasing rates. Wherever you use non-renewable resources, you have to be extracting them at declining rates. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's the basis of the oil depletion protocol. We have to apply that basic principle of sustainability to oil, which is our most important non-renewable resource, first, and then start applying it to everything else that we use, that we take out of the Earth's crust. Because lots of other things are running out too. It's not just oil and other fossil fuels. It's copper, it's indium and gallium and gold and uranium. I mean, there's a very long list of minerals and metals that are depleting very, very rapidly, and we'll start to see serious economic problems just within the next few decades as a result of that.
Well, this is a more or less a crusade then, isn't it? It's the first job is to convince people that there is a problem, the second one that it can't be fixed within the current system, and the third one is there has to be a radical change of philosophy and practice of economics and politics along the lines that you indicated. My only point is it's far harder to convert someone if you don't have something to convert them to. And I see that as the primary problem for us, for people who see the need, have got to step 2, want to go to step 3, something new. Isn't this urgent? To come up with something that that we can really put on the table for people?
Yeah. Now, we have to remember one thing, which is that human beings existed for thousands and tens of thousands of years before fossil fuels, before modern capitalism. Societies existed, including complex societies that did not even use money. So the problem we're talking about is certainly solvable in principle, because what we're really talking about is going back to the normal condition of human existence. What we've known over the past 200 years has been extremely abnormal. And as that brief period of human history, the fossil fuel bonanza, comes to an end, it's not the end of the world necessarily, it's the end of a particular way of life. Mm-hmm. Now, what follows it? Well, it's not necessarily, going back to the 19th century way of life or the 18th century way of life, because we've learned a lot in the meantime. A lot of ridiculous things and a lot of very good things. We know, for example, a lot more about how to build topsoil than we did a couple of hundred years ago. It's not being generally applied. Most of modern agriculture is still mining topsoil as though there's no tomorrow, but we have agricultural experts now who know how to build topsoil, how to produce food organically without fossil fuels.
If I could interrupt there, I really don't think it's a technical problem.
It's not a technical problem.
This is not technical. This is human consciousness. And I don't know that the past does hold the key here. The past does indicate that we have to accept that social systems, empires come and go, and we may well be in the decline, and if we live long enough, see this one go, and that will cause us personally to have to undergo tremendous change. My point is that change is far easier to bear if you know where you're going.
Sure.
If something collapses around you and you don't have any alternative, well, it's the battered wife syndrome, isn't it? You got nowhere to go. You're very insecure about leaving the home because you don't have one to go to, so you put up with the battering. Now, I think rather than put up with that, we
we need examples.
urgently need to say, look, this is a place that you can move to now, at least in your own head, and then start applying that. And once you've got the principles right, you can invent ways to be sustainable and move forward. But at the moment, we're still in the Cassandra thing.
Well, we don't have any perfect society somewhere on Earth that we can look to and say
we certainly do not.
We should all live like that.
Absolutely.
But we do have comparative degrees to look at. I mean, for the U.S., for New Zealand, for that matter, per capita rates of oil consumption are very, very high, and yet that isn't necessarily tied to high levels of happiness or satisfaction. We can look to, Europeans use half the energy per capita as North Americans, and they're doing just fine. So clearly North Americans could use their energy much more efficiently without having to sacrifice all that much. Now, okay, compare Europeans with people in apparently much poorer countries than that. Very often there's no correlation whatsoever between energy use and happiness and satisfaction in life.
I would go further and say, not only reduce your oil consumption, reduce your money consumption. That just like oil, having less money doesn't automatically mean you're less happy.
Right.
On the contrary, and that this obsession with money, that money has become God since modern capitalism, because modern capitalism is mammon. Money is king. And now people are going to have to wean themselves off the other great addiction, which is greater than oil, money. And this requires a tremendous shift in consciousness. My only point is, okay, you can wean yourself off money, but where do you go then? Happiness? But happiness in itself, no. It needs something more concrete.
Well, yes, but we have to. What's happiness all about? Well,
Very good question.
It's about a sense of community. It's about a sense of being involved with the people around you. It's a sense of intergenerational connection, so that the older people feel they have something worthwhile to pass on to the younger people, and the younger people have a sense of having something worthwhile to learn from their elders. And it's a sense of a good job well done, being able to use your capacities as a human being, your muscles, your hand-eye coordination, your intelligence to do things in your life that have immediate material benefit. Now, the way most of us make a living these days, we're pushing buttons and collecting checks.
Beyond question. My point again is, I'm totally with you. I'm breaking through an open door there, as they say. What's on the other side of that door? What do we, is this and rather than the socialism as the answer, it's sort of like the re-socialization of humanity, in order to not only have a sustainable economy, but to have a sustainable psyche.
Right.
That's what's required, and I'm just trying to point to that. I'm not saying I have all the answers.
No, I don't think anyone
I'm
does.
trying to point and say, urgent need to stop trying to invent some gadget that's going to make you $1 billion and start thinking about a different way of thinking.
Sure, but there are all kinds of people who are thinking along these lines. There are eco-villages springing up all over the place. There's the transition town movement in the UK. There's the relocalization network that includes about 120 communities now, all over, mostly North America, but elsewhere in the world as well. So we're not talking about something that is completely theoretical. No. There are millions of people who are already thinking along these lines and doing things in their own lives to relearn skills and reconnect with their communities to build a
maybe if we can
post-fossil fuel world.
To Al Gore, he'll do another program and say, beyond climate change.
Yes, right.
And beyond capital, and then we might have a chance.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.